Thank you very much for having me to talk at the Northern Imagination Forum. I'm a third year PhD student at the University of Hertfordshire, and my project, overview of my project, is to answer a question that I mean to try and give a theory to a question that was posed actually in Fiora's talk this morning by Mike Stewart, who they just mused over, well, you know, when we imagine and what's the image doing, you know, what's the imagistic aspect of imagination doing? There doesn't seem to be a sort of really interesting question. A lot of people are asking it in the literature, and their theories over what exactly it's doing are still developing. So I have a particular theory in mind, and my PhD is basically built around that theory. But today I want to focus on, I think, what I deem to be a couple of motivations behind the view that imagination, the imagery when we imagine, doesn't actually do anything at all. It's just sort of an accessory, or it comes along for the ride. And sometimes that, I think, has come out in some of the literature, or that sort of view, that assumption. And there are reasons behind this. So before I go into those reasons, I'm going to also focus on a paper by Amy Kynes called Putting the Image Back into Imagination. And this was written in 2001, so it's an old paper. In fact, she said that it came straight out of her own PhD, so it was either her first publication or a very early publication of hers. I think it's a very interesting paper, so I'm going to focus on it today. It's very rich, it's loaded with ideas. And I'm quite sympathetic to what she's trying to do in this paper, but also have some disagreements. And I have to say that she is not my target, and this paper is not my target, but I think that it is a symptom of this sort of view that I've just outlined, that in fact when we imagine and there's imagery present, that the image has either no role to play, or it has a very diminished role. It doesn't have a very significant role in imaginative thoughts. So I think it's symptomatic of that. And I think even she would agree as well, because she starts this paper at the beginning of the paper sort of explaining that imagery has been sort of discombobulated from the imagination because of a view to want to computationalize, or she calls have a scientific explanation of the mind. This comes from behaviorism, and then functionalism, and then physicalism later on, to sort of reduce all mental states to physical components. And imagery is quite a big issue. It's an annoying issue when it comes to trying to do something like that. So where I think she's coming from is here. Sorry. Here, I don't know if you can see my screen, you can see everyone on it. Here, the image isn't necessarily an imagination. This is one sort of reason why we think that perhaps the image isn't doing anything when we imagine. It's a widely held view by philosophers that we can imagine without imagery. Not all philosophers necessarily agree with this. There's loads of debates over whether or not imagination should necessarily have imagery. Amy Kynes is an image essentialist herself. She believes that when we imagine, imagery must be present, otherwise it's not an instance of imagination. Different philosophers have argued that imagination without imagery is actually supposition, and so on and so forth. Some philosophers just don't, you know, even they would deny imagery at all as being a necessary condition of imagination, such as Nichols. And this is because not only does there appear to be instances where we can imagine without imagery. Sometimes it's referred to as propositional imagination, cognitive imagination, non-imagistic imagination. It has all sorts of names and guises. I'm not going to dispute the fact that maybe we can imagine without imagery. That's not my debate, it's not my discussion. And I used to be a hardcore image essentialist, but I've since softened my view. I'm quite open to the idea that maybe we can, especially if you look at how sort of Kathleen Stock has outlined fictional imagination and those sorts of instances where we assume certain propositions for the sake of the fiction in order to engage in an imagining, and that is not illustrated by imagery. And that seems quite plausible to me. But I am interested in when we imagine with imagery, and and an image is present, what that image is doing. So I think that some of the motivations behind saying that imagery isn't doing anything at all is because if we can imagine without imagery, and it's not a necessary condition of all instances of imagination, then the whole thought could potentially be explained without imagery at all, without invoking imagery. So if it doesn't have a role every time, maybe the role is not that great at all, or maybe we can explain the whole instance of imagining without thinking about what the image might do when it is present. So I think that's one motivation behind it. But Amy herself talks about a different sort of motivation in her paper. And this motivation is the fact that imagery can come away from what it is that we're imagining. Now, if you're familiar with this paper, as I've said, she's an image essentialist. She makes some arguments for why it is that imagery must be present in order to make imagination the type of mental state that it is. So she compares and contrasts imagination with other types of intentional mental states, such as belief, such as perception, such as thinking, and gives sort of reasons why she thinks that imagery must be present, at least when we imagine, even if that imagery isn't doing anything in making the thought the type of thought that it is. It has to be present. And so the other problem that she's then facing is, well, if the imagery is present, you know, what is it doing? And she outlines 3 reasons why the image isn't actually doing anything when it comes to influencing what the thought is about, or that at least some philosophers have assumed that it's not doing anything in making the thought it is, or what it's about at all. I'm not sure whether she agrees wholeheartedly with these sorts of arguments, but she certainly sees them as a threat to the imagery model, because what she does in this paper is try to take apart 2 claims. So what she calls image essentialism, so she wants to hold that claim while distancing it from what she calls the individuative claim, that the image is having any influence over the thought or making it the thought it is, content fixing. And she separates these 2 claims. So she wants to hold one while distancing herself from the other. And there are 3 sort of motivations for the idea that imagery isn't doing anything to fix the thoughts, even if you are image essentialist like her. So one is that parts of our imaginative thoughts are not always represented by the image alone. She gives an example of, you know, imagining Bill Clinton doing budget calculations in his head. So we can imagine Bill Clinton, we have the image of Bill Clinton, but the budget calculations in his head are not captured by the image alone. It sort of overruns the image. There's other bits of the thought that the image is not expressing or representing. Another example, just to diversify our examples here, one by Dominic Gregory, who has written a very good paper called Imagination and Mental Imagery, says, you know, if you can imagine a sleeping cat, but if we try to imagine a sleeping cat whose owners are holidaying in Paris, there is a part to that imaginative thought that's not fully captured by the image alone. We have an image of a sleeping cat, but not the rest of it. So that's one way where maybe we think that the image is not doing anything in making the thought it is. There's something else over and above that, or at least it's lacking in some way. Another thing that Amy Kind in her paper outlines is actually an example by Alan White from 1990, and I can't get hold of his book, it's out of print, but I take Amy's word for it, that you can have the same image and use it for 2 different imaginative thoughts. So the imagery of a sailor scrambling ashore could be exactly the same as that of his twin brother crawling backwards out to sea, yet to imagine one of these is quite different from imagining the other. So we have same image in mind, but the thoughts are 2 completely different thoughts. They have different contents. So the image can't be doing anything to make the thought it is. It can't. It just seems if we can recycle imagery for different sorts of thoughts, then how can it have an influence over making that thought the thought it is? It seems like a kind of a strange thing to do. So she concludes that for every token imagining, imagery is an assigned essential role, but this does not entail that the image must play the role of making that particular imagining the type of imagining it is. And a third example she outlines in this paper is that we can have two different images and we can use them for the same imaginative thought. So here is her example. We can imagine Bill Clinton giving a campaign speech, but in Kind's view, it should not matter whether we imagine Bill Clinton giving a campaign speech with him wearing a hard hat or a tuxedo. As long as we're imagining Bill Clinton giving a campaign speech, the fact that he might be wearing a hard hat or tuxedo doesn't have any influence over the content of the thought. It doesn't seem to matter. So the image is not having an influence over the extra aspects of the image that we might use when we imagine this state of affairs is not necessarily having any influence over the thought itself. This seems like a very counterintuitive thing to me. I want to immediately say, no, but it does. I'm just imagining two completely different, I'm imagining something different because the image is different. But that might be seen as sort of like pushing the question back, if you like. I'm not really answering how the image is influencing the content of that thought, but it does seem quite counterintuitive. So, you know, you could parcel this off in kind of different ways. You could say, you know, as long as you're imagining that the cat is sleeping, it does not matter to the image. It does not matter to the imagining whether the cat is sleeping on a chair or on a floor. Again, I want to say no. In one case, I'm imagining that the cat is sleeping on the floor. In another case, I want to say that I'm imagining the cat is sleeping on a chair, and that those are two different thoughts by virtue of the fact that the image that I'm using is different. So she concludes that we can assign mental imagery an essential role in imagining without having the particular image involved be essential for determining the imagining's type. The imagery model, which is committed to the essentialist claim, is not thereby committed to the individuative claim. And that's sort of like the purpose of her paper. She sees that there are problems where we can have either the image does not fully capture the whole content of the imaginative thought. We can use different images for the same state of affairs. So we could, such as Bill Clinton case, and we can seem to recycle the same image for different sorts of thoughts. So the image kind of comes away from what it is that we're imagining, or doesn't fully capture the full content of our imaginative thought. Therefore, the image cannot be playing any role in fixing what it is that we're imagining. So here she separates these two claims. And like I said before, I'm not sure if Amy is fully committed herself to the idea that imagery does not individuate thoughts, but the motivation, her mission in this paper is really just to defend image essentialism, while also explaining why it is that philosophers beforehand might have been quick to throw away image essentialism because of the individuative claim, because there is this worry that the image is not fully fixing what's going on in the imaginative thought. But we do have a problem if we accept Amy's argument wholly as it is so far. And that is, if it is essential for us to have imagery when we imagine, but that image is not doing anything in fixing the content of the thought or fixing it as the thought it is, it leads to a rather strange outcome where, theoretically, so long as we have some kind of imagery, we should be able to imagine Bill Clinton giving a campaign speech with any image. If it's not having any influence over the imaginative thought, it's not fixing any of the content, then we should be able to imagine Bill Clinton with a pink elephant. Now, of course, there are going to be instances where we don't get the target right. You know, maybe my daughter really thinks that that is Bill Clinton. The elephant, the pink elephant, is Bill Clinton. Maybe, you know, maybe it really is called Bill Clinton. And so when they imagine, there's no success criteria here. I'm not talking about success criteria that we have to imagine correctly. I'm talking about the idea that when we imagine and we presume that the image is illustrating someone we think is Bill Clinton, we're getting that right, at least according to us, right? That we're not just using any kind of image to imagine Bill Clinton, any random image, at least to us, it makes sense that it's of Bill Clinton. And we want to avoid this because this is very strange. And so we do need to try and explain what the image is doing when we imagine. And Amy has a theory of her own, which I'll go into in a second, but she does put this challenge. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, this is the challenge I'm interested in trying to answer. So this is why her paper has been so influential and important to me. I've read this thing so many times since my master's degree. And I think if it wasn't for Amy, I wouldn't be doing a PhD. So I am a big fan. She says, no other plausible explanation for the role of the image has been forthcoming. The essentialist claim tells us only that images are involved essentially in imagining, but the question remains, what does the image do in imagining? Thank you, Amy, you've given me my PhD. I now know what I'm going to research. So here's her explanation before I go on to mine. She thinks that imagery is the paint of imagination. She's just like, you know, if it's not individuating, but it is essential, what is it doing? It's the paint. And it just not only does it distinguish it from thinking, but it illustrates for us. So this is the role she gives to it. Her main idea is that imagery is the paint, in the same way that a painter cannot paint a canvas without paint, an imaginer cannot imagine without the mental paint of imagery. And this is a direct quote from her. This metaphor, imperfect though it may be, helps us to see what the image is doing in an imagining. Suppose I were trying to paint a portrait of Bill Clinton. As we have seen, in such a case, the paint I use would not itself be the object of my activity, rather the role the paint plays would be to capture the object of my painting, in this case, Bill Clinton. Similarly, if I were trying to imagine Bill Clinton, the image I use would not itself be the object of my activity, but the role that the image plays is to capture the object of my imagining. So there's two things she's talking about here. One is about an object, which I will talk to you in more depth in a second, but the idea of capturing. So she says that imagery is to capture the thought, not to individuate it, but to capture it, to illustrate it, but it's absolutely essential to the role of imagination. And it's quite an enticing metaphor to use, but I'm not 100% happy that it is the right explanation for imagination. I think that we have to give a more substantive explanation as to what the image is doing, rather than it just be the paint. And here are a few reasons why I think this. I don't think we should allow the analogy, because one reason is when we think that P, the proposition expressed in the thought is represented with words and sentences, not ink. Why should imagery be any different? So when we think that such and such is the case, we say that the content of the thought is expressed through language. We use language structures, words and sentences which are structured in a particular way, which represents the state of affairs that's being expressed through that, it's being expressed through that representation. We wouldn't say, it would be an odd thing for us to say that that when we think that the stapler is pink, I'm looking at a pink stapler, when we think that the stapler is pink, this is expressed through a representation of ink. We don't say things like that. We say it's through words, through language. These are the representations that are used in order to express that state of affairs. So why should we do this differently with imagery? Why should we say that that imagery is reducible to paint? Why don't we just actually say, no, it's an image and it's of something? Why would imagination need paint other than to distinguish it, as Kind does, from thinking? So again, I think it pushes a problem back where beforehand she's tried to differentiate imagination from thinking through virtue of the fact that imagination is imagistic, thinking is not necessarily imagistic. Just to say that, oh, well, imagination has paint, thinking doesn't have paint. Again, why would the imagination need paint as just a distinguishing factor from thinking? It must have a more substantive role to play than just kind of being a substance that comes along with it. There has to be more to it than that. So I'm not sure that the analogy is covering everything that it ought to be. And she seems to think this herself, and she does outline and remind us of what she calls the object claim, that when we imagine, the object of our imagining is not the image. The object of our imagining is the thing that we are imagining. So when we imagine Bill Clinton, because it's easy to think that, especially if it's of some non-existent entity, when we close our eyes and we imagine, you know, Santa Claus, I am imagining Santa Claus, I can see Santa Claus, but that is not the object of our imagining. That is a representation which is of the object of Santa Claus. Same thing with Bill Clinton. When we have an image and it is of Bill Clinton, the object is not the image, the object is Bill, but she does insist that when we do this, the image has to be of Bill Clinton, right? So our representation has to be of Bill Clinton. She wouldn't like the pink elephant scenario herself, but we still need to explain how this is the case. So to just say that there is some paint going on doesn't fully capture it. We need to explain how our images are of certain things. So it has to be doing more than that. And to say that there's no individuating going on, I'm not sure that that's the right way of going about it. And she seems to think this herself in some way, at least, because in her later work, in her later papers, she starts to become quite interested in answering, talking about imagination as a skill. I've been to lots of very interesting talks on that, and she's doing some really interesting work on that, and the epistemic significance of imagination, specifically the image. When we imagine, what the epistemic significance is of the image. So she's written a few papers on this, and she often features Nikola Tesla, Temple Grandin, Einstein. They're ideal imaginers. They're so good at imagining, and the really good aspect of their imagining is their ability to visualize, their ability to use and manipulate imagery specifically when they imagine. Right, so they're not propositionally imagining with no imagery, they're using imagery, and they're using it really, really well. And the interesting thing about these ideal imaginers is, I mean, there's an aspect where she says, look, we could practice and we could get good like them, but the interesting thing of them is the visual aspect that they're using, and the fact that they use this to justify epistemic claims about the world. So it's specifically the ability to visually run visual simulations in their mind's eye with the imagery that is used as a justification for things that they know to be true of the world, or they think is going to work out well in the world. And they're very good at doing this, but it is the visual aspect. So again, I want to go back to this idea, well, if all imagery is paint, if all it does is paint the imagination and it's not doing any individuative work, I mean, this is extraordinary if imaginers ideal imaginers are able to rely on imagery to do something. So again, I want to say that there has to be something more going on than it just being illustrative. And that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it. Some of you have already heard me talk in previous talks, and I have done some work on the idea that visual mental images express propositions. So that's my big thesis, that's my big theory. I actually think that visual mental images do partly fix the content of imaginative thoughts. Even if they don't fix the entire thought, I do think they have an influence over individuating the thought as the thought it is. They might have a limitation in how much they can represent what's going on in a thought, because we have those issues where the image doesn't quite capture the full content of the thought, and the image can be reused in different situations. But I certainly think that it has some influence on individuating the thought as a thought it is when we imagine, and imagery is present in that imagining. And the way I go about it in later work in my PhD is to argue that it's because visual mental images are able to express propositions just as much as sort of like language structures are. And that's for another time, arguments on that. But that's my talk today. So thank you very much for listening so nicely and patiently to me. Thank you.